So perhaps a better title for this would be that this work was the first rest stop on the never-ending road to provable security. And Cormac Hurley from Microsoft Research will tell you why the road is never-ending. So what I'd like to do is to explain what root of trust is, why is it hard to establish, and how to do it. And then we'll have question and answers. The full paper is a CMU Scilab report, much longer than the published paper. It has about 25 pages, double column. It includes the proofs. It also includes implementation details for common processor and instruction set architectures. All right, so what is it? So imagine that you are looking inside a laptop or a desktop or any computer, and what would you find there? Well, first of all, you'll find some CPUs and some primary memory connected to some bus system, and then you'll have some device controllers, which we call devices here. So for example, you might have a network interface card, you might have a disk controller, for sure you have those. You have a system management unit, and of course you might have USB controllers that can be plugged in. The fundamental point here is that some of these controllers have persistent memory. So the state of a device or a device controller comprises the content of the processor registers and of the memories, in particular of the persistent memories. Not all controllers, of course, have persistent memories. So essentially, the system state here is the union of all device states at some times t. Now, it turns out that some of that persistent memory gets what we call persistent malware. So for example, Arrigo Trigliuzzi found persistent malware in network interface cards around 2008. Around 2013, Der Spiegel published an article emphasizing that all US-made disk controllers destined in computers for Russia, Iran, and some other countries had, in fact, malware on it, and it took Kaspersky about 2 years, almost 2 years to find it. Later on, people found persistent malware in the Intel manageability engine, and so on. So essentially, this malware is controlled by a very powerful adversary. How powerful? Well, this adversary knows all software secrets, knows all penetrations and exploits that have been used in the past. Obviously, our adversary comes to all these conferences and collects all the data. This adversary can break all complexity-based cryptography, and in fact, might even have access temporarily to my computer. So after performing these accesses, this powerful adversary can in fact spread malware even in components that don't have persistent memory. So essentially, the state of my system is all red, meaning that I do not know what is it contained in this persistent memory and, of course, processor registers. So what I like to do, I like to attach a verifier to my computer and have the verifier initialize the state of my system, the complete state of my system, to chosen values. These are values chosen by the verifier. And after that, the verifier would like to check that the system state has only the chosen values and nothing else, plus the program counters point to the right instruction execution. So that's essentially what we call a root of trust state. Now, if this root of trust state is established as very high probability, provably so, then the system actually is all color green, except for the contents of the disk, which at this point doesn't matter because you don't execute instructions off the disk. All right, so we'll see how we'll deal with the disk a little later. So essentially, a secure state is a root of trust state, namely a state that has chosen content that satisfies some predicate P. That predicate P might be no malware or the system is disconnected from the internet. Once you establish a secure state, you can perform verifiable boot. That is, you can either boot your trusted code in a secure state or you detect unknown content, which of course may be malware. So essentially, your system starts in a red state, you perform verifiable boot, namely establish root of trust, secure state, and load your software. And after a while, your adversary takes it over. Again, you have a red state. And of course, you perform verifiable boot again, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 weeks, half a year later. And life goes on in this flip it game mode. Remember the flip it game. This one was designed by, the game was defined by Alina Oprea, Ari Jules, Ron Rivest, and Martin Van Dyke. Wonderful paper if you care to read it. So anyway, this is an instance of that flip it game. So essentially what you notice here that verifiable boot requires a secure system state, which requires root of trust establishment. And so does trusted recovery. You want to be able to recover in a secure state, as we were told by the trusted recovery guideline of the NSA, which was written many, many years ago, maybe about 30 years ago. All access control models start in a secure state. All software that is stateful must start in some known state. All right, so the establishing root of trust and secure state are pretty reasonably general concepts. Now, we are seeking unconditional solutions. And as we are just told, those are solutions that have no secrets, no trusted hardware modules, and no bounds on the adversary power. All right, now, what do we need? We only need God's throw of fair dice. And we know that we can get that with quantum random number generators pretty easily, pretty cheaply. Then we need device specifications. This is not as easy, but it's doable. So with this, we establish unconditional solutions. And these solutions are extremely important, at least in my view. One is they have no dependency on the results or the truth of conjectures. So those are unknown facts. There are no conjectures to depend on. Secondly, there is no dependency on the unknowable. That is the behavior, the skills, and the interests of the people who put secrets in our systems. Third, second, the defender will have here a provable advantage over any adversary, which means that we flip the traditional asymmetry where the adversary has an advantage over the defender. No advantage here. It's the other way around. And of course, these solutions outlive technology. They might be useful in the future. They have a long shelf life, pun intended. So quantum computing, they ought to work in that area. All right, so now, of course, I know of no other unconditional solutions to any software security problem. All right, so now, why is this hard? I mean, this has been tried, or some of this has been tried for about 20 years now. So let's start out with a very simple system. And the simple system, which is all messed up, contains an initialization from a local verifier. And that initialization, what you see messed up there, is actually a family of space-time optimal computations. Okay? So essentially what will happen next is that the local verifier constructs out of random bits, constructs a nonce, and that nonce causes the space-time optimal computation to run in that memory M and registers R. Now, the result of the space-time optimal computation is returned in time t, and if that's okay, the verifier measures the result and the time, then we know that there is no malware on this device. So the verifier, of course, is trusted, and obtaining trust here is extremely easy. The verifier doesn't disclose the random bits. The verifier knows the correct outcome. It can pre-compute it. And of course, the verifier can measure the time on the device, which is not so easy, but definitely doable. Now, what we have here is actually a very simple, in principle, a very simple reduction. We have a reduction performed by the trusted verifier from the space-time optimality to a malware-free device. The problem is that this simple reduction is not so simple. Basically, the space-time optimality has to be non-asymptotic. Asymptotic optimality doesn't work because the adversary can come closer than your algorithm to the optimal solution, and the verifier loses. Furthermore, Optimality cannot be on an abstract machine. It cannot be on a Turing machine, for example. It cannot be on an infinite field. It has to be on a instruction set architecture that's real and the processor that's real, caches, pipelining, and the like. So what does complexity theory tell us? There is no such thing. We have very few solutions which have non-asymptotic optimal bounds and none that work on real computers. So for example, the closest thing that we have is Horner's rule for polynomial evaluation, which is uniquely optimally infinite fields, two operations, but not optimal in finite fields, like on our computers, and certainly not on any device with any reasonable instruction set architecture. So this is the very first hurdle. Now suppose that we solve this problem. So if we solve this problem, then we immediately face another problem. The other problem is that the execution of our optimal computation is done by an adversary. And the adversary is dishonest. What the adversary does, it adapts the code to the input. In other words, it changes the code as it sees the nonce. It could output a guess, and we have to know the probability of that guess. Or, worse, it uses a powerful remote proxy. So essentially, if the computation lasts half a minute or 5 seconds, let's say, the adversary contacts a quantum computer in the back room. The quantum computer executes a computation in 0 time, returns the result, and the malware delivers the results to the verifier. Everybody's happy, but in effect, the memory is full of malware. Okay, so this is not so easy to resolve, but it can be resolved. However, complexity theory offers no help here. They don't deal with adversaries on real machines. No solution exists. Now, how could it help? Well, for example, complexity theory might tell us that if the malware beats the space-time bounds, lowers them, for example, then the computation of the machine should automatically become unpredictable. That would be great, a great beginning. And with that, we can actually come up with engineering solutions to make sure that we prevent the back-end infinitely powerful adversary from communicating with our evaluation code controlled by malware. All right, so suppose that we solve all these problems completely magically. All of them are solved. So we are done with the first problem. The second problem is that this reduction is insufficient. Now, why is it insufficient? Well, very simply, what the adversary can do, it can pre-program a future interrupt, an interrupt that triggers immediately after the output of the correct result in correct time. So essentially, when this happens, that interrupt could trigger a reboot from the disk, for example. The verifier is happy, it got the correct result. The content of the memory is wrong. It's full of malware. By the way, this example was worked out by Jan Lin, who's here in the audience, and he can tell you more about some of these attacks which were actually implemented. So now, how do you solve this? Simple. Just disable interrupts. Write an instruction, disable interrupts, and we are done. Well, not so easy. That you could prove that you have an instruction in memory by digital signature, for example, but you cannot prove that you have control flow because that instruction can be skipped by malware. So essentially what you notice here is that control flow integrity in the optimal computation and afterwards requires control flow integrity before the optimal computation. So control flow requires control flow, and if we're not careful, we'll go into a circle very soon. So we have to solve this problem. Now, imagine that we solved it. And of course, the paper shows you how to solve the problem. Then we have the third problem. The third problem is quite thorny. Namely, the verifier has to deal with multiple devices, multiple device controllers, for example. And in this case, sequential execution of the optimal computation on the two devices does not work. Why? The first device executes. Sometime later, sequentially, device second starts. And in between, we have a time gap. And in the time gap, the idle device I modifies or corrupts the already attested device J. And then it restores its computation quite easily, perhaps by reading doing a memory copy from the disk, and receives this nonce, executes correctly, and the system is in the wrong state. Now, so how about ordinary concurrency? It turns out that ordinary concurrency doesn't work either. The second device, device I, which at this point has not started yet, helps device J circumvent its time bound and complete the execution early, then restore its computation and complete its computation in time. Again, we end up circumventing the bounds of one of those computations. Similarly, if the devices start roughly about the same time, but one ends early, the malicious device J can actually issue a fake verify to device I, which dutifully resolves the particular computation, and device J ends up early, finishing early, again, circumventing the bounds. So what we really need is concurrent verification with scalable bounds. So the fast device I would scale its time bound independent of the memory bound, such that the beginning between the two computations and the ends occur more or less at the same time. No device can help the other one execute. So with this, we are more or less done with the requirements. So we have code optimality in adversary execution, unpredictability, composition, scalable bounds, except that we haven't talked about secure time measurements. So I will not cover that, but suffice it to say that we have to deal with caches and jitter, execution jitter due to caches, clock jitter, this is uncorrectable clock jitter, multiprocessor interference, and our friend, the remote proxy, powerful adversary. Verifiably, we cannot just argue and hand wave. We have to prove that those things are handled. Okay, software attestation. Software attestation has different goals and roots of trust. They require optimality, but they can't provide verifiable control flow. They can't provide scalable bounds, independent of the memory bounds, and the time measurements are not so precise. They are somewhere between 0.2% of the total time and 2.6%. That's what Yanlin measured in 2015. Cryptographic attestation, remote attestation using secrets. Secrets and digital signatures and MACs replace the optimality, but notice what happens. None of those protocols provide you with protocol atomicity. So again, they are weaker solutions in some sense, but stronger in other senses, right? So they are different. Why stronger? Because these protocols can be executed at any time to determine remote software attestation, not just on remote boot. So different problem. All right, so how do you do it? Well, here is a solution overview. First, we invent this notion of randomized polynomials, which comprise k-independent coefficients, which are also independent on the input x. So once we do those, we notice that these polynomials give us k-independent, almost universal hash function families, which, unlike anything that you've seen before, are space-time optimality on a concrete word random access machine. This is an abstraction of your processor, ISA, caches, pipelining, and the like, multiprocessor and the like. Furthermore, this space-time optimal bounds are scalable. So there are no trade-offs between memory and time. You can scale time, for example, independent of the size of the memory. Now, so the randomized polynomials is a totally new concept. K-independent, almost universal hash functions. It's a new kind of such hash functions. Optimality is new, and scalability of bounds is new. So now, our cRAM machine, which is an abstraction of a real processor, has a constant word, 2 operands for instructions for convenience, instructions executed in unit time, which is a disaster because you can't distinguish them based on their execution. You have memory words, processor registers, general purpose registers, special processor registers, PSWs, and so on. Addressing all forms, architecture features, as we mentioned, caches, virtual memory, TLBs, pipelining, multi-core. ISA, all possible integer instructions, signed and unsigned. So you have, in addition, all loads or stores, all unconditional or conditional branches, all predicates. and all computation instructions. Now, on this slide, you have probably between 250 and 400 instructions. And real systems have those instructions built in them. So if you look at Agner Fox's webpage at the Technical University of Denmark, you actually see different processors with different integer instruction set architectures. All right, so that's our word cRAM. Now, how do you actually construct these polynomials? Very simply, random bits, convert them into k random numbers plus an input x. That's our nonce. Then we construct the coefficients. Those are polynomials. They are implemented mod p, and we know that they are k-independent and uniformly distributed from the Carter-Wegman paper in 1981, not the 77 or 79 paper. Then we XOR each one of those coefficients with a word or memory or a word of processor register, special processor registers. And notice that SI XOR VI is actually a k-independent coefficient which is uniformly distributed. We multiply by x to the particular power, and what we get is now a randomized polynomial family indexed by the nonce. This family happens to be a k-independent universal hash function, almost universal hash function. And of course, it's optimal in cRAM, the processor that we defined. The memory is k plus 22 words. Time is 6k minus 4 times 6d. And what you notice here, very importantly, there does not exist any function on any input y such that when you apply the function on that input to collide with the evaluation of that polynomial, except with the probability t over p, if this function executes faster than the bounds. So what you have here is an extra collision property that universal hash functions don't have. Now, with this in hand, you notice that our bounds are scalable. You scale k, and m and t go up. You increase d, and time scales up independent of the memory. Memory hard function need not apply because this is ruled out. Okay? So now the killer result. Horner rule, remember, was not optimal in a finite field, certainly not optimal on an instruction set architecture such as cRAM. So Horner rule was proved optimal in 1966 by a Soviet mathematician called Victor Pan, and the unique optimality was proved by Alan Borodin in Toronto in 1971. So essentially, what I did here, I applied standard Soviet KGB techniques to Horner. That is, I squeezed Horner's execution time and memory until Horner confessed to optimality, to unique optimality. As a matter of fact, Horner confessed in writing. So there is a theorem and a proof. So it's not disinformation. It's proven, right? So essentially, this theorem is answers to Alexander Rostovsky's 1954 question, is Horner rule optimal for polynomial evaluation in a realistic model of computation? And in fact, this is, by the way, the motto of chapter 16 in computational complexity by Arora and Barak. With this honest evaluation, we can then prove the optimality of our functions, randomized polynomials, honest evaluation, and then we can prove that dishonest evaluation being optimal and obtaining those results that you've seen before here, namely that evaluation, memory k plus 22 and time 6k minus 4 times d, that is a dishonest, that's an adversary evaluation. So at this point, we are done. And I would like to show you a couple of more things, just in case you have questions, a couple of slides, if I may. Basically, notice what happens. We initialize the memory. And what we did, we disabled interrupts. But the function that we compute captures not only the presence of the instructions, the disabled instructions, but also their effects. So that's a trick to get control flow going in the face of interrupts. You take a particular fingerprint, if you wish, of the instruction plus its effect. You cannot do it just for the instruction or just for the effect. You do it for both. OK, so execute the input. We get the input. We initialize the general purpose registers in time t0. We execute Horner. We output. And now the device is malware free. But guess what? We are in log P. P is the highest prime that fits in a word of W bits. So we have a sliver of unknown content. So essentially what we do at that point, we perform a second pass now in malware-free memory. That sliver cannot allow malware to exist. Okay? So once we've done that, we can actually do all sorts of other things, including multiprocessors, segmented memory in which that last segment, its execution is faster than a round trip to our powerful adversary in the backyard. Right? So essentially, we rule out very, very powerful adversaries. All right, so now we can return to questions and answers, if any. And if not, I'll have some questions for you.
Question? Yeah,
yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Chris Hauser from ISI at University of Southern California.
Yes?
I just had a question about assumptions. Do you make any assumptions in terms of the of any eventual time delays in the communication channel between the verifier and the prover?
So yes, so basically what one of the first slides showed is that the verifier is connected to the bus system. In other words, the verifier cannot be connected to a device controller itself. It has to be connected to the bus system in order to perform the time measurements. So essentially, the verifier can then issue on the bus system several sets of random numbers, k random numbers. K, by the way, can be between 2 and 8. The largest k that I've ever seen is 22, right? And that's for processors that have 32 general purpose registers. So yes, the verifier has to be on the bus.
And in terms of practical latency that could still happen in terms of CPU cycles, do you have like any concrete numbers for that?
All right, so essentially there are, obviously there is jitter. Now, how do I handle jitter? Let's say that I have to handle uncorrectable jitter. That comes at very high frequencies, long execution times, or multiprocessors. And if you recall from this slide, I partitioned the memory into segments. Now, those segments are so small or so large that an adversary cannot measure uncorrectable clock jitter. And by the way, if you notice in the multiprocessor sense, none of the processors access the memory at the same time. So there is no interference in the multiprocessor sense. So I anticipated all those. Now, in addition to that, jitter in terms of caches. Guess what I disable up there? Caches. So lots of modern processors can disable your cache. You operate with the cache disabled, no jitter. Speed is not of the essence here. The space-time bounds are of the essence. So the caches are disabled. TLBs are disabled.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we are out of time already, so let's have a coffee break and thank our speaker again.